Next up, we have Aspen Murray, and Aspen will be presenting on place attachment and policy, how climate and housing policy in British Columbia address the emotions of home. Welcome, Aspen.
Hi there, everyone. So thank you so much for having me, first of all. Just making sure, is my audio and screen all good? I'm going to take that as a yes. So yeah, hello everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me here to speak today. My name is Aspen. I'm a PhD student at Concordia University, which is located on the unceded Indigenous territory of the Ganegahaga Nation. And I also have co-founded an eco-anxiety group at our university and for our local community. And yeah, just very excited today to present to you a little bit about my ongoing research. I think this is a great segue from what Lindsay just spoke about. I'm going to speak a little bit more about the policy context of where things are at least in British Columbia, regarding climate and housing and sort of the emotions of place attachment and home. So, British Columbia, like most of Canada, is currently facing two converging crises. It's facing a climate crisis as well as a housing crisis. But there's actually little research on kind of how they're treated in policy and how they interact in that way. I think the interaction sort of boils down to a triangulation of impacts, physical impacts, financial impacts, and of course, psychological impacts. And with that in mind, my research questions sort of address the following. So I start out with a bit of a broader focus, looking at how climate change adaptation is being approached in housing policy in BC, and then looking more specifically at the emotional dimensions and whether current policies actually address the emotional dimensions of disaster and concepts of home. And my key findings are that, first of all, climate adaptation and housing seem to compete for priority more than they work together or complement each other in policy. And moreover, emotions seem to have not yet transitioned from sort of the research and reporting and assessment stage into actual concrete policy action in the province. So I mentioned these two kind of converging crises from the BC context, things that we can look at for climate change. So the Strategic Climate Risk Assessment tells us that the main discrete or immediate climate risks for the province are seasonal wildfires, seasonal water shortages, and heat waves, all of three of which the province has already experienced dramatic examples in just the past few years alone. As well, the 2021 Canadian Census tells us that BC has a higher than average level of core housing need, which is like numbers of households that are living in housing which is unsuitable, inadequate, and unaffordable. And it's also in the context of their local community. And that's higher than the national average of 10.1%. And also, average rental rates in BC increased by 30% from 2016 to 2021, which puts at least 100,000 people at risk of losing their housing. And I mentioned this sort of triangulation of impacts. So, starting off with the financial and physical, very simply put, climate change is going to make energy, insurance, and repairs and retrofits more expensive. Increasing temperatures will make energy more expensive. In Canada, disaster claims have increased drastically just over the past 10 to 15 years. And then climate change also requires costly repairs and retrofits. One example of which is artificial cooling, which historically hasn't been necessary in a lot of parts of BC, but now it is. And then physical impacts very directly, climate change and climate disasters will damage and lead to loss of a lot of housing stock, which is particularly detrimental, of course, in a housing crisis. And then finally, the psychological impacts, which is sort of what we're all here to discuss. So I think the way that climate and housing, the nexus here comes in regarding psychological impacts, has to do with specific concepts of home and place attachment. So, of course, we all know at this stage that climate change causes negative impacts to mental health, but it can also specifically rupture folks' concepts of home, their attachment to place, their place identity over time, and even their ontological security due to, ongoing environmental change or, very specific acute climate disasters, and can also lead to phenomena like solastalgia, of course. So, with all of that in mind, as Lindsay kind of just alluded to, we have all of this information about the impacts that are happening, but what really remains to be seen is how this knowledge is being connected to action. So first of all, more broadly again, how have the interactions between climate change and housing been addressed in policy in BC? And have the psychological dimensions of climate change and home entered policy in BC at all? So, how did I go about answering these questions? I took a multi-methods qualitative approach. First of all, I conducted interviews that were semi-structured with 20 informants over the course of summer 2024. I identified them through a combination of organizational mapping, recommendations from my research team, and snowball sampling. And then I went ahead and recruited them via email or invited them to participate. And these interviewees were housing and climate professionals at provincial and local government level, as well as housing organizations and industrial associations. And I tailored the interview questionnaire for each subset of interviewee. Then I also conducted a document analysis of 64 provincial climate and housing documents. I identified these documents through a combination of browsing relevant pages on the province of BC's website, searching the Canada Commons and the Gallup portal, and they were to be published or tabled from between 2000 to 2024. And then I went ahead and qualitatively coded the interview transcripts and documents in Atlas TI. And what did I find? So, first of all, there were definitely a few key laws and policies that came up regarding the climate adaptation and housing nexus through my analysis. And the first of which would definitely be building regulations. So, the most recent edition of the BC Building Code, which came out just last year, added a one-room cooling requirement. So, this basically requires that all new housing that is built has at least one room that can be kept to a maximum of 26 degrees Celsius. So this was referenced as like a significant change by a lot of my interviewees. As well, lots of grants, subsidies, and incentives, lots of heat pump incentives, as well as the province directed BC Hydro to create an income qualified free AC program for low income households. And then, as well, lots of reference to adaptation planning, reports, and assessments. So, the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy that came out in 2022, as well as the 2019 preliminary strategic climate risk assessment that I referenced earlier on. Emergency response. So the province overhauled the Emergency and Disaster Management Act back in 2023, which gave a lot more responsibility to municipalities for disaster planning and integrated climate more thoroughly. And also just like acute local action from municipal governments on implementing cooling centers and adding misting stations to address extreme heat. And then lastly, institutional reform. A lot of my interviewees, their roles were brand new from like the last 3 years, or they were part of new units that were being created. So lots of like capacity expansion, I would say. With all of that in mind, though, definitely something that was very salient was an overarching tension between priorities. So, as I mentioned, starting with housing and climate, it seems like over the past few years, as the housing crisis has just become so much more serious in the province, the policy priorities have just shifted so much towards housing and kind of left climate in the dust a little bit. And as well, there seems to be a tension between building fast and building well. So with that crisis comes, we need to build as many homes as possible and get units online. But are we being intentional about how and where we're building them? And then second of all, there seems to be a bit of a tension between mitigation and adaptation. It seems like mitigation is more integrated into housing policy than adaptation. There was only one mention of adaptation in the documents I reviewed versus 11 mentions of mitigation. And sometimes it seems like tough choices arise. So, for example, with artificial cooling, as we see this uptick in extreme heat in BC, artificial cooling becomes a life necessity measure. But of course, it also increases emissions. So we have to be intentional about how we implement these things. And lastly, from the emotional and psychological dimensions of climate disaster side, did this emerge? So it seemed like this emerges a priority almost exclusively in reports and as an emerging concern rather than actually in the policy that I reviewed and with my conversations with my informants. Recent risk assessments, like the 2019 one, definitely gives hope to how it might emerge in coming years in policy. In my document analysis, I found that the ways in which it's mentioned seem to be more of a focus on mental health, with just a few mentions of things like place attachment, home, and place identity. And informants mention emotions more as like an emerging issue and something they're concerned about, with very little to no concrete policy mentioned. So with all of that in mind, is climate change adaptation being comprehensively considered in housing policy in BC? So short answer, I would say no. It seems that generally the issues compete with each other rather than complement one another. And that's particularly concerning to me because I think it could lead to maladaptation in a couple of decades from now. Of course, it's important to build housing as quickly as possible and get folks off the street or create more units that folks can actually afford, as we are in a housing crisis. However, are we building those homes on floodplains, or are we building those homes in high-risk climate areas, or are we not building them with the climate resilient measures that they need to be built with? So that might be a good situation for now, but in 10 to 20 years, it could lead to a situation where A, we need to retrofit everything, which also came up as a challenge. It's very difficult to do climate retrofits. And also B, are we going to be in a situation that's makes us less prepared actually for climate disasters and climate risk, which is certainly not also going to help with the mental health and climate change intersection. And then as well, it seems like mitigation is more integrated than adaptation and that it uses harder policy instruments, like, of course, the carbon tax, like home appliance energy efficiency labeling on things like fridges and stoves, as well as the energy and the zero carbon step codes, which are two codes inside the BC Building Code. There's a floor level that builders need to meet, and then it basically goes step by step and increases over the years. And then municipal councils can actually mandate that builders reach a higher step earlier than mandated. So it basically allows municipalities to take more aggressive climate action. And then second of all, do current policies address the emotional dimensions of disaster in home? So no, while the issue did emerge in interviews and reports, it didn't emerge in any concrete policy, showing that it's not really formalized yet at this time. However, I think it could emerge because it's represented in a number of key recent reports. For example, in the 2019 risk assessment, psychological impacts were kind of assessed as one specific category of impacts of different climate hazards that were assessed. So the findings from that should be useful for policy. And as well, the 2021 Coroner's Report Death Review Panel from the heat dome talked about the contraindication between extreme heat and chronic mental health conditions. And the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy starts to get at issues of stress and climate change. So it really seems that the connection between research and action still needs to take place. So on that note, I kind of lead with the call to action. I'm so grateful to be at this summit. It's my first time to be here, and I'm so passionate about the intersection of these issues. And so I think it's really up to us as researchers to continue to advocate for our knowledge to be integrated into action and specifically into policy action. So thank you so much for having me here today and listening. I'm very happy to chat about any questions at this time. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Aspen. That was a really great presentation. Two things that are always at the forefront, especially as somebody living in Vancouver. And I'm wondering if you can speak to sort of the national scale of this. So we know this is a problem in BC. I know your research is really focused on British Columbia.
Mhm.
In your work, have you found any areas in different parts of the country where they're doing really well with this?
Yeah, I haven't had the opportunity yet in my research to kind of compare across the rest of Canada. So I haven't yet really come across any examples of where in the rest of Canada folks are doing really well. I would speak to just like the reason for the focus on the focus on BC would basically because BC has kind of been conceptualized as like a climate leader in Canada with, it's being first to have the carbon tax and so forth. So that was the reason to kind of look specifically at BC and see, are they doing better in this area? But yeah, I haven't had the chance to kind of compare and contrast across Canada yet, but that would be a really interesting thing to look at.
Always interested to know who's doing it really well.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Sabrina Guzman Skotnitsky, and she asks, I'm curious about the geographic spread of your interviewees. For example, rural versus urban in BC.
Mhm. I would say I had a pretty good split. I'm sorry, I can't speak to the specifics of how many were rural and urban, but I did travel to several rural areas when I was doing this research. And then those that I couldn't get to in person, I connected with them over Zoom. So it was a pretty even split between rural and urban in BC.
Great, thanks. Okay, our next question comes from Naomi with the Jellyfish Project. What are examples of how climate emotions and distress could be incorporated into concrete policy or implementation on housing?
Mhm. It's a good question to think specifically about housing. I think for the most part, I have looked at it from the perspective of like climate disaster preparedness. And we also have to think like about, how is like what types of housing are specifically targeted when it comes to that. But again, coming back to like that nexus really has to do with like concepts of home and place attachment and the role that like the home as a concept versus even just like as a structure plays in that. So I would say more as like a concept and how this is like climate disaster and long-term environmental change um, leads to negative impacts on like psychological impacts. Um, and so, yeah, with that in mind, some examples could be like specific psychological supports that could be put into place after climate disasters or other things in general that just aren't being addressed with this as like a specific outcome of climate disaster and like long-term environmental change. So that's something, this is like the first paper of my PhD, and that's something I'm actually planning on looking at in my coming papers. And this one was really to kind of set the policy context.
Great, thanks. Our next question is from Megan, and she asks, what types of policies might address mental health, and how can we support communities that are evacuated for weeks, months, or even years?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really great question as well. And I'm excited to keep digging into that in my future papers. I'm planning to go to specific communities and interview them more on the types of policies and the types of supports that they think might be useful. Some things that come to mind are like support groups or just really like any type of like concrete psychological support that can be put into place. Because to my knowledge, it doesn't seem like that really exists yet. So that would be a really great starting point, would be to have any sort of like structured support for people who have been evacuated or displaced over the long term.
Great, thanks very much. And do we have any more questions for Aspen while she's here? Well, thanks very much, Aspen. Oh, wait, we do have another one here from Helen. When meeting with MLAs for advocacy purposes, the issue arises with politicians that the housing affordability crisis now surpasses the need to address climate change. How can we emphasize that these crises are truly connected, as your research demonstrates? Great question, Helen.
Yeah, very, very great question. And I think we do need to keep emphasizing it. I think from my own conversations, even just more broadly, talking to people, they don't immediately see the connections between the two crises. So a lot of my work has had to do with seeing how do they actually converge and how do they interact with one another. And a lot of my interviewees brought that up as well. So I think it's really up to us to kind of connect the dots on how the two interact and how they exacerbate one another as well. So yeah, to just kind of have that information and use it in our advocacy is super, super important.
Great, thanks. And again, ending on that note of advocacy and call to action, um, it's, it's you're leaving us with some hope and a plan for the future. So thank you for your great research.
Thank
Um,
you.
and now we're going to take about a 15-minute break until our poster presentation. So Please take a moment to move around and do what you need, and we'll see you back here at 10:30 Pacific. Thanks to all of the presenters on a really interesting panel. See you soon.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.